Welcome to our channel, Auburn Chronicles. If you enjoyed rural stories, like and subscribe for more, and tell us in the comments what time it is and where you're watching from. And now, Adam will take us into today's story.
On the morning of April 12, 1987, a 58-year-old farmer named Vernon Classens stood at the edge of his back 40 watching a Case IH dealer's flatbed truck reverse through his gate. The driver climbed down, unlatched the tailgate, and began sliding rusted parts onto the ground. Axle housings from 1206 tractors, sheet metal from 1086 cabs, a complete front end assembly from a 1466, hydraulic pumps still caked in 30-year-old oil, drive shafts, PTO shields, steering columns bent from decades of use. Vernon had agreed to this. The dealer in town, Halderson Implement, was clearing out their back warehouse to make room for the new Magnum line. They needed the space. Vernon needed scrap value and some parts he could maybe use. They struck a deal. The dealer would haul it all out to his place, dump it in the corner of a field he wasn't planting that year, and Vernon could keep whatever he wanted. The pile grew for 3 hours. By noon, there were 2 tons of obsolete Case IH iron sitting in his pasture grass, most of it manufactured between 1972 and 1981. Parts for tractors that had been considered outdated even when they were new. Vernon walked the pile slowly. He picked up a hydraulic cylinder, set it down, lifted a fender, let it drop. He didn't know yet that this junk would define the next 15 years of his life, or that in 1990, 3 years after the dump, neighbors would start showing up unannounced, asking if he still had specific parts they suddenly couldn't find anywhere else. What he did know was that throwing anything away felt wrong. If you believe in long-term thinking, second chances, and the quiet value of things other people discard, this story will matter to you. We're building a library of farming memory, the decisions that didn't make headlines but shaped entire lifetimes. If that sounds like something worth preserving, consider subscribing. These stories take time to research and time to tell right. Your support keeps them going. Vernon Classens grew up in southwestern Minnesota during the Depression, the second son of a dairy farmer who kept equipment running with baling wire and patience. His father never bought new. He bought broken, fixed it, and ran it until it couldn't be fixed anymore. Then he'd strip it for parts and start over. Vernon learned young that a machine was only obsolete if you didn't understand it. By 1963, Vernon had his own 240 acres, flat prairie ground, decent soil, corn and soybeans. He bought his first Case IH tractor that year, a 706 diesel, used from an auction in Worthington. It had 3,200 hours and a cracked engine block someone had welded back together. He ran it for 19 years. In 1978, he bought a 1086 from the same Case IH dealer that would later dump parts in his field. The 1086 was 5 years old, had seen hard use, and needed a clutch. Vernon installed it himself. That tractor became his primary machine for the next decade. He wasn't sentimental about equipment, but he was practical to the point of stubbornness. If something could be repaired, you repaired it. If it couldn't, you saved the parts. That philosophy made him the wrong person to throw away 2 tons of old iron, and the right person to understand what it would become. For the first 18 months after the dump, the pile just sat there. Vernon pulled a few pieces he thought he might need: a set of rockshaft arms, a hydraulic pump that looked rebuildable, some cab glass that wasn't cracked. He tarped over the more delicate parts and let the rest weather. Neighbors driving past would slow down, look at the pile, shake their heads. One of them, a man named Roger Dietrich, stopped by in the summer of 1988 and asked Vernon what he planned to do with it all. "Haven't decided," Vernon said. "You know, most of that stuff's for tractors nobody runs anymore," Roger said. "I run one," Vernon said. Roger laughed. "You and maybe 4 other guys in the county." He wasn't wrong. By 1988, the shift to Magnum Series Case IH tractors was nearly complete. The 1086, the 1206, the 1466, they were disappearing from active fleets. Dealers had stopped stocking parts. Case IH's parts system had moved on. If you still ran one of those machines, you were on your own. Vernon didn't think much about it at the time. His 1086 was still running fine. He had what he needed. But in October of 1989, something changed. A farmer from 2 townships over, a man Vernon had never met, pulled into his driveway in a pickup truck and got out holding a piece of paper with a part number written on it. "Halderson told me you might have this," the man said. It was a hydraulic control valve for a 1206. Specific. Obsolete. Not available from Case IH anymore. Not available from aftermarket suppliers. Not rebuildable unless you had another one to pull seals from. Vernon walked out to the pile. Dug around for 20 minutes. Found 3 of them. He sold the man one for $30. The man stood there holding it like he'd been handed something irreplaceable. "I've been looking for this for 8 months, he said. Vernon didn't say anything, but he started thinking. By the spring of 1990, word had spread. If you needed a part for an old Case IH tractor, something from the 70s or early 80s, Vernon Classens had a pile in his backfield that might have it. The calls started coming in. Then the visits. Farmers showing up with part numbers, diagrams, measurements. Some of them drove 2 hours. A few came from Iowa. Vernon didn't advertise. He didn't have a system. People just knew. At first, he didn't charge much, $20 here, $40 there, enough to cover his time digging through the pile. But by late 1990, he realized something. The parts weren't just rare. They were becoming critical. A farmer named Eugene Stahl came by in November looking for a PTO shaft assembly for a Tevn 86. He'd blown his during corn harvest and couldn't finish his last 60 acres without it. The Case IH dealer had told him the part was discontinued. An aftermarket supplier said it would take 6 weeks to fabricate one, if they even could. Vernon found the part in 40 minutes. He charged Eugene $80. Eugene paid without hesitating, installed the part that afternoon, and finished his harvest 3 days later. Vernon started to understand what he had. Not junk. A hedge against obsolescence. In 1991, Vernon built a shed. Nothing fancy. Pole barn construction, open sides, gravel floor. He moved the parts out of the weather, organized them by tractor model, started keeping a handwritten inventory. He didn't call it a business. He didn't get a tax ID. He just made it easier to find things. By 1992, he was getting calls every week, some from people he knew, most from strangers. The requests were specific: a throttle linkage for a 1466, a set of rear wheel weights for a 1206, a cab door latch for an 856. These weren't parts you could improvise. If you didn't have the exact piece, the tractor didn't work. And Vernon had them. He started charging market rate, whatever the part would have cost new, adjusted for scarcity. A hydraulic pump that sold for $120 in 1979 might go for $200 in 1992, if you could even find one. Vernon could find one. People paid. His neighbors started asking questions. Roger Dietrich stopped by again in the fall of 1992, watched Vernon pull a steering shaft for a farmer from South Dakota, and said, "You're making money off this, aren't you?" "Some," Vernon said. "Off junk," Roger said. "Off parts people need," Vernon said. Roger shook his head. "You know what I did with my old 1086? Traded it in 1985. Got a Magnum 7120. Haven't thought about that old tractor once." "That's fine," Vernon said. "You're hanging on to the past," Roger said. Vernon didn't argue. But he thought about it later. Was he hanging on to the past? Or was he just prepared for a future where the past didn't disappear as cleanly as people assumed? He didn't know yet, but he was about to find out. The turning point came in the spring of 1994. A farmer named Leonard Voss called Vernon from a shop in Iowa. Leonard ran 1,100 acres of corn and soybeans with 2 tractors, a Case IH Magnum 7130 he'd bought new in 1991, and an old 1086 he kept as a backup for light work and emergencies. The 1086 had thrown a rod through the block. Leonard needed a replacement engine. He'd called every Case IH dealer within 200 miles. None of them had one. Case IH's parts system listed the engine as discontinued. Rebuilding the block wasn't an option. The damage was too severe. Leonard was facing a choice: scrap a perfectly good tractor because one component failed, or find an engine somewhere in the used market. He called Vernon. Vernon didn't have a complete engine, but he had 2 engine blocks in rebuildable condition, a full set of pistons, 3 crankshafts, and enough ancillary parts to assemble what Leonard needed. It took Vernon 2 weeks of work. He pulled parts, cleaned them, had a machine shop in town, checked tolerances, assembled the engine on a stand in his shed, and test-fired it with a belt-driven flywheel. He sold it to Leonard for $3,800. Leonard drove out to pick it up, loaded it in his truck, and installed it himself. The 1086 ran for another 12 years. But something else happened during those 2 weeks. Vernon realized he wasn't just selling parts anymore. He was keeping tractors alive that the manufacturer had left behind. By 1995, Vernon had become something no one had planned for: the last resort supplier for an entire generation of Case IH equipment. Farmers who'd bought 1086s, 1206s, 1466s, and 856s in the 1970s and early 1980s were now facing a problem. Their tractors still worked. They were mechanically sound, fuel-efficient by the standards of the era, and paid for. But the parts infrastructure had evaporated. Case IH had moved on. Dealers had cleared their shelves. Aftermarket suppliers didn't see enough volume to justify manufacturing obsolete parts. If you needed something specific, you had 3 options: fabricate it yourself, scrap the tractor, or call Vernon Classens. Vernon's phone rang constantly. He started spending more time in the shed than in the field. His wife, Marlene, began taking messages, writing down part numbers, scheduling appointments. They never advertised. They didn't need to. One Saturday in July 1995, 6 different farmers showed up at Vernon's place within 3 hours. 2 from Minnesota, 1 from Iowa, 1 from South Dakota, 2 from Nebraska. All of them needed parts for tractors. Case IH no longer supported. All of them left with what they came for. Vernon made $1,400 that day. Roger Dietrich, who'd mocked the pile in 1988, stopped by that evening and saw the parade of trucks leaving. "You're running a business," Roger said. "I'm helping people," Vernon said. "You're making money off obsolete junk," Roger said. Vernon looked at him. "You still running that Magnum 7120? "Of course," Roger said. "Ever have trouble finding parts?" Vernon asked. "No," Roger said. "It's a modern tractor. Everything's available." "Good," Vernon said. "Hope it stays that way." Roger left, but Vernon kept thinking about that conversation. What happens when the modern tractor becomes the old tractor? What happens when Case IH stops supporting the Magnum line the same way they stopped supporting the 1086? Who do you call then? In 1996, Vernon's pile was nearly gone. He'd sold, traded, or scrapped most of the original 2 tons. What remained were the most valuable pieces: engines, transmissions, hydraulic assemblies, hard-to-find linkages. But something unexpected had happened. Farmers had started bringing him parts. A man from North Dakota showed up in April 1996 with a pickup bed full of parts from a 1206 he'd finally scrapped. He didn't want money. He wanted Vernon to keep the parts available in case someone else needed them. "I looked for a tie rod end for 8 months in 1993, the man said. "If you'd had it, I would have paid anything. I don't want someone else going through that." Vernon took the parts. By the end of 1996, he had 3 more piles growing in his shed. Parts from farmers who'd scrapped their old Case IH tractors but couldn't bring themselves to send the components to a metal recycler. They brought them to Vernon instead. It became a network, informal, unplanned, but real. If you scrapped an old Case IH tractor, you called Vernon. If you needed a part for one, you called Vernon. He became the central node in a system that Case IH had abandoned but farmers still needed. And he didn't do it for the money. By 1997, Vernon was 68 years old. He'd made enough from parts sales to pay off a loan on a grain bin and upgrade his planter, but most months he broke even. The time he spent digging through inventory, the fuel he burned driving to pick up parts from farmers 3 counties away, the shop space he'd built, it barely justified itself financially. But he kept doing it, because every time someone called looking for a part, Vernon remembered what it felt like to need something and not be able to find it. He remembered standing in a Case IH dealer's parts department in 1983, asking for a hydraulic cylinder for his 706 and being told it was discontinued. He remembered the dealer suggesting he trade the tractor in. He remembered thinking, "This machine still works. Why should I throw it away just because you don't want to support it anymore?" He'd kept that 706 running for 4 more years, fabricating the part himself in his shop. Now he was doing the same thing for people he'd never met. It wasn't business. It was principle. The calls kept coming. The 1086s were aging into their third decade. The 1206 were antiques. The 1466 were collector's items to some people and essential daily use machines to others. Vernon kept finding parts. Farmers kept showing up. But something was shifting. In the spring of 2001, a younger farmer, maybe 35 years old, came by looking for a cab door latch for a 1086 his father had left him. "My dad bought this tractor in 1979, the man said. "It's the only thing I have left of him. I'm not scrapping it." Vernon found the latch, charged him $40. The man stood there holding it, looked at Vernon and said, "How long are you going to keep doing this?" Vernon didn't have an answer. He was 72 years old. His knees hurt. His back hurt. Marlene had started talking about selling the farm, moving into town, slowing down. "Don't know," Vernon said. "Because I don't know what I'll do when you stop," the man said. Vernon thought about that for a long time after the man left. He'd never intended to become essential. He just accepted a load of scrap parts in 1987 because he didn't like waste. But 14 years later, he was the only thing standing between functional tractors and the scrapyard, and he was getting old. In 2003, Vernon started slowing down. He still took calls. He still dug through inventory. But he stopped driving long distances to pick up parts. He stopped working weekends. He started turning people away if he didn't have what they needed. The shed was still full, but the energy wasn't. Marlene asked him in the fall of 2003 if he'd thought about what would happen to all the parts when they sold the farm. Vernon hadn't. "We can't take them with us," she said. "I know," Vernon said. "And nobody's going to buy a farm with 3 sheds full of old tractor parts," she said. Vernon knew that too. But the thought of scrapping it all, sending 30 years of accumulated parts to a metal recycler, felt wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. In December 2003, a Case IH dealer from Sioux Falls called Vernon. The dealer had heard about his inventory and wanted to buy it all, the whole lot, sight unseen for scrap value plus 10%. Vernon said no. The dealer called back a week later and offered 20% over scrap. Vernon said no again. "Why?" the dealer asked. "You're sitting on a gold mine and you won't sell it. What are you waiting for?" Vernon thought about it. "I'm waiting for the right person," he said. "There is no right person," the dealer said. "Those tractors are done. The people who ran them are retiring or dead. In 10 years, nobody's going to care about a 1086. Vernon hung up, but he wondered if the dealer was right. In the spring of 2005, Vernon's question was answered. A man named Kyle Bergstrom called from western Minnesota. Kyle was 29 years old, had just bought his first farm, 320 acres, and was trying to assemble a fleet of equipment on a budget that barely existed. He'd bought a 1986 Case IH 1086 at auction for $8,500. It ran well, but it needed a 3-point hitch lift cylinder and a set of rear wheel weights. Kyle had called 6 dealers. None of them had the parts. Someone told him to call Vernon Classens. Kyle drove 4 hours to Vernon's farm on a Saturday morning in May. Vernon was in the shed when Kyle pulled in. They didn't talk much. Kyle explained what he needed. Vernon found both parts in under an hour. He charged Kyle $240. Kyle pulled out a checkbook, wrote the check, and then stopped. "Can I ask you something?" Kyle said. "Go ahead," Vernon said. "What happens to all this when you're done?" Kyle asked. Vernon looked around the shed. 30 years of parts, thousands of pieces, the remnants of a generation of case iron that the world had moved past but hadn't quite forgotten. "Don't know," Vernon said. Kyle looked at him. "I'd take it." Vernon didn't say anything. "I'm serious," Kyle said. "I don't have money now, but I'd take it, all of it. I'd keep doing what you're doing." Vernon studied the kid, young, serious, running a 1086 because it was what he could afford, not because it was what he wanted. "Why?" Vernon asked. "Because someone has to," Kyle said. Vernon and Kyle talked for 2 hours that day. Kyle explained his situation. He'd grown up on a farm, left for college, worked in town for 5 years, hated it, and come back. He had debt, no equity, and a belief that if he worked hard enough and spent carefully enough, he could make it. The 1086 was part of that plan. It was old, but it was simple. It was paid for. It didn't have electronics to fail or software to update. If something broke, Kyle could fix it, but only if he could find parts. "You're the only reason I can keep that tractor running," Kyle said. Vernon understood, because he'd been that person 40 years earlier. They made a deal that day, not a formal one, not a contract, just an understanding. When Vernon was ready to be done, Kyle would take the inventory. He'd move it to his own farm. He'd keep the network going. He wouldn't scrap it. Vernon didn't ask for money. Kyle didn't offer any. It wasn't about money. It was about continuation. Vernon kept running the parts operation for 3 more years. In 2008, at 79 years old, he told Marlene he was done. They listed the farm for sale. Vernon called Kyle. Kyle drove out in June 2008 with a semi-truck trailer and 3 friends. They spent 2 days loading parts, engine blocks, transmissions, hydraulic pumps, sheet metal, axles, wheels, steering columns, PTO shafts, everything Vernon had accumulated since 1987, plus everything farmers had brought him in the years since. It filled the trailer completely. Kyle moved it all to his farm in western Minnesota, built a shed, and set up the same system Vernon had run. Word spread. The calls started coming to Kyle instead of Vernon. Vernon sold the farm in October 2008 and moved into town with Marlene. He didn't stay in touch with the parts business. He didn't need to. He knew Kyle would handle it. But in the spring of 2010, Kyle called him. "I sold a transmission last week to a guy in Iowa," Kyle said. "He told me he'd been looking for it for 2 years. He almost scrapped his tractor." "That happen a lot?" Vernon asked. "Every week," Kyle said. Vernon smiled. "Good. I wanted you to know," Kyle said. "What you started, it's still going." Vernon thought about that after he hung up. What he'd started. He hadn't started anything. He'd just accepted a pile of junk in 1987 because he didn't see the point in throwing it away. But 23 years later, that junk was still keeping tractors running. Tractors Case IH had abandoned. Tractors dealers wouldn't support. Tractors that should have been scrapped a decade earlier, but were still working because someone had saved the parts. Vernon didn't think of it as legacy. He thought of it as common sense. If something still works, you don't throw it away just because it's old. You keep it, you maintain it, you pass it on. Vernon Claessens died in November 2018 at the age of 89. Kyle Bergstrom is still running the parts operation as of 2024. He's now 48 years old, owns 640 acres, and runs 2 tractors, a Case IH Magnum 280 he bought used in 2019, and the same 1086 he bought at auction in 2005. The 1086 has 22,000 hours on it. It still runs. Kyle's parts inventory has grown to include not just the 1086, 1206, 1466 generation, but also early Magnum series components. Because those tractors, the ones that were modern in 1988, are now 35 years old, and Case IH has stopped supporting many of them. Kyle gets calls every week from farmers who bought Magnum 7120s and 7140s in the 1990s, kept them running, and now can't find parts. He has those parts, because farmers bring them to him when they scrap their tractors. The same cycle Vernon started in 1987 is still running. The Case IH dealer in Sioux Falls that offered to buy Vernon's inventory in 2003 went out of business in 2016. Roger Dietrich, the neighbor who mocked Vernon's pile in 1988, scrapped his Magnum 7120 in 2014 after a transmission failure. The repair cost more than the tractor was worth. He called Kyle Bergstrom looking for a used transmission. Kyle had one. Roger never acknowledged the irony. The pile of parts dumped in Vernon's field in April 1987 wasn't junk. It was insurance against a future where the machines you depend on outlast the companies that made them. Vernon didn't see it that way at the time. He just didn't like waste. But 37 years later, those parts are still in use, still keeping tractors running, still preventing good machines from being scrapped just because the supply chain moved on. The parts weren't valuable in 1987. They became valuable when people needed them and couldn't find them anywhere else. That's the lesson. Value isn't determined by newness. It's determined by necessity. And necessity doesn't disappear just because a company stops making something. It just gets harder to meet. Vernon met it for 21 years. Kyle has been meeting it for 16. The tractors are still running, the parts are still there, and the network continues. Not because it's profitable, because it's necessary.